Everyone, I'm Geoff Keighley, and welcome to a very special event, a conversation with Christopher Nolan. Chris, great to have you with us today. We are going to chat about Tenet, also your career, you as a filmmaker, and we've got questions from the internet, from fans around the world who wanted to chat with you today and get some insight from you. So I think we should just dive right in.
Let's dive in.
All right. Well, the first question comes, we're going to talk about Tenet, first of all, here. And this one comes from Andy Blackshaw. And he wants to know, a simple question, but how did you select the title Tenet? And I'm curious sort of in the name, but also in your creative process, like the name of a movie, when does that come to you? Is it early or late?
I usually have an idea early on, sometimes a long time before. In the case of Tenet, I had the title very early, I mean years ago. And obviously the fact that it's a palindrome, was the sort of jumping off point, but it was also what the word means. It's the notion of belief. And for those who've seen the film, haven't seen the film, I'm gonna try to be reasonably spoiler-free, but because a lot of people are just getting the opportunity to see the film now. But for me, when you watch the film, there's a sense in which we're addressing the idea that we're all sort of imprisoned in a way in our own views of the passage of time, of what's going on in the world, all the rest. And so there is this kind of leap of faith to the idea of an objective reality. So there's the idea of belief or faith involved with what these characters are choosing to invest in terms of what's really going on in the story. And that was always an intriguing idea to me, and I wanted to be right, up front on screen.
All right, there you go. Next question comes from Anna Bruschi and many others. This is a good one. The protagonist, John David Washington's character, a lot of people have been wondering why he decided to hide or not go into his background. We know very little of his past. What did he do before becoming a spy? I know we're going to get an answer to that, but...
No, the point is to not answer that.
Yeah.
I really wanted to tap into that kind of great tradition of the anonymous protagonist. I mean, for me, it dates back to the TV show The Prisoner, for example, where he's known by a number, or the number he resists, number 6, known as The Prisoner. But also, I was thinking a lot of Sergio Leone westerns, like with Clint Eastwood, as, The Man with No Name and all the rest. I think there's something really compelling about jumping into a story and being told essentially to concentrate on the here and now, to pass through this experience in the present tense. Ironically, it's a film that deals with time, but it's really important as you watch the film that you're just kind of looking over this guy's shoulder and going with him. Yeah. It's a very present tense presence in the film. And so deliberately not naming him, not including any of the information about how he might have arrived there, I think hopefully it draws attention to that idea and keeps people really focused on the here and now. Obviously, John David and my discussions with John David, we had to, have some sense. He really needed to have a sense of who this guy was and where he'd come from. But we really didn't want that specified in the movie.
I see. So you develop some of that, kind of in your head, and John does a little bit of that, but you're not exposing that to the audience.
Yeah, we weren't massively pedantic about it. We weren't going through, who his parents were and where he was born and all the rest. But we needed to have a sense. He needed some guidance from me of, what's this guy's background. Some of which is loosely indicated in the script. Yeah. The jumping off point for the film is clearly, working, a Secret Service organization, probably the CIA, that and so forth. But we talked about the fact that, for example, he clearly has a lot of military training and that kind of thing. And but we didn't want to specify any of that for the audience. But the actor needs to know the underlying truth of the character to make it a consistent characterization.
And that sort of leads into this next question from Majorca, and she wants to know, I can feel the tender affection between the conversation attitude of protagonist and Neil. Did you explain to John and Robert the special relationship between the two characters?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it was there on the page for them, actually. Okay. But then once you cast the film, because their relationship, as you watch the film, it becomes more and more important to the story, I suppose you'd say. You know, there are some ambiguities to the relationship, and then there's a camaraderie that develops that's very important. A lot of that was indicated on the page, but once you finish a script, you then look around and say, okay, who could play these parts? You put people together, and then, you know, you see the chemistry that develops. And these guys, you know, John David and Rob Pattinson, you know, they just connected. And it really, really, for me, it just worked with what we were trying to do with the story. It was really fun to watch these guys work together. And I think it's really fun to watch the characters interact in the movie.
Oh, it definitely shows on screen. This next question comes from Twitter. Were there multiple endings you thought of using and had to decide from? If so, what were some of them? I know, you know, often the ending for the film you'll think of pretty early in the process of kind of where you want to go. But were there other scenes or, you know, not deleted scenes, but sort of other concepts of the end of the film?
I mean, no. The simple answer is I don't go into a project without knowing the ending, because I think the ending is it's the most important part of a feature film, I think. I think that's one of the things that keeps feature films very distinct from television. Because in a feature film, you know, you can have a 4-hour movie and the last 5 minutes can let it down, and then for the audience, the whole experience gets thrown out the window. It's like the end of an anecdote or the punchline to a joke. Like it justifies everything you've seen. So I always come up with the ending early on, and hopefully it's something that, you know, it has to be something that emerges really specifically from the story situation that you're examining. So no, I don't sort of look at a mixed bag of potential endings and then sift through them. The only time I've ever, in my work, I've ever sort of had, as it were, multiple endings is when I made Insomnia for Warner Brothers years ago. They were very insistent that I shoot an alternative ending. I don't want to give away the ending of that film because a lot of people won't have seen it and maybe they'll get to enjoy it, but they wanted me to shoot two different endings, and I agreed to do that. Fortunately, because I'd shot this alternate ending, they never asked to see it. They knew it was in the can, and then they let me, you know, test screen the ending we all loved, and we went with that. But that's really the only time I've been in a situation where there was possibly going to be an alternate ending. That's not generally something I'm comfortable with at all.
Right. Speaking of the ending, another question from Twitter. Did you make a Casablanca reference in Neil's last scene? Not line.
Well, I don't want to have any spoilers for people who haven't seen the film. Yes. But yes, there's very much a Casablanca reference in the last scene.
Excellent. This next question comes from Vishesh. Wants to know, how do characters return to their original timelines after traveling backwards? There's obviously a lot going on with you know, characters moving in different timelines. I assume the question is sort of, you know, how do they go? Do they go back to their original timeline, or do they stay on that timeline? How does that work?
The question slightly misunderstands the rules.
Yeah.
Their timeline is their timeline, and through the rules of inversion, it can be inverted, and they can move backwards through time. They can then reinvert using a turnstile and then stop moving forwards in time, but they will continue to be on that timeline.
Right. So it's all still one timeline.
It would be easier to draw a diagram. It's all still one timeline. It's one. The best way to think of it, and this relates to the earlier question, is if you look at John David's experience and you follow him through the entire story, that's a single timeline that you're following. But that timeline can move both forwards and backwards. And that's where I was interested in this rule set, because it's quite distinct from time travel per se, or time travel movies where
multiple realities or something like that.
Exactly, and they refer to the possibility of multiple realities, but the terms of the storytelling are pretty tight in that you follow this character and you're looking over his shoulder the whole way, and you're experiencing his timeline and how that can meander forwards and backwards.
Yep. Okay, great. Now we're talking a little bit more about some of the production pieces of Tenet. This one comes from Johnny. You said that Tenet brought things that you had been thinking about for at least 20 years. What was the moment you realized that the script was ready to shoot?
Well, it was more a question of the moment I realized that the set of ideas was ready to commit to the page in screenplay form. I won't sit down to write something until I kind of know that I'm ready to, and the ideas are all in balance, and that can take a very long time. I'm not somebody who does a lot of multiple drafts over the years. I tend to just take notes and draw diagrams and think about concepts and sort of think about, okay, how could you apply that to different forms of storytelling? What might the screenplay be? But once I've kind of focused in on that set of ideas and I know I'm ready to put it into screenplay form, that's sort of the big leap for me. And then the screenplay is the sort of jumping off point for the execution of, how you're actually going to go and make it.
So I remember reading at one point that you had sort of done, I think, the first 2 acts, and then Nathan, you sort of talked about it, and then you were like, then you're going to go into the 3rd act. Like, how do you sort of tend to write the script? Do you sort of go through one pass? Or
I go through linearly.
Okay.
So I write the script, from the first frame to the last frame. Okay. And I tend to build up the drafts as I go. So I tend to rewrite, as I add a scene, I'll very often go right back to the beginning of the script, rewrite through, and then add the next scene, and sort of layer it that way. Oh. Every writer's different. Everybody does it differently. That process works for me because I've done so much planning before I write the screenplay.
Right.
So I know
where you're going.
I know where I'm going in the sense of the narrative movements, the narrative ideas. But yeah, I sort of rewrite as I go. And every now and again, and this is one of the only times I had to do it, I had to involve Nathan at an early stage in a design sense. So I'd only got 2/3 of the way through. So I made him read that, which was a bit unfair. And then, carried on, and a month later or something, I showed him the whole thing.
Wow, very cool. This question comes from Sean about sound design. Your sound design is incredibly immersive. It seems to me more distinct than other Hollywood directors, from score to sound effects to dialogue. What is your focus when finalizing the complete sound design? What is your goal? Watching Tenet in theaters, I felt transported. Is your aim to control the viewer's senses and focus?
I mean, yes, it's an excellent question because it sort of answers itself. Sound and the potential of sound behind those big screens in movie theaters just keeps getting better and better and better. And so you have so many aspects to the audience experience that you can tap into using sound, whether it's sound effects or music or the combination of the two. And it's one of my favorite parts of the process and one of the things I get most excited about. And with each film, we try to find ways to bring something new to it, to sort of challenge the audience with it, to make them kind of feel something. And I've been inspired by a lot of great filmmakers of the past who similarly are interested in sound. I think of, David Fincher and all the great things he's done with sound over the years, right back to Seven, was an incredible movie to watch in a movie theater and hear the way he used backgrounds and a lot of intrusive sound that you wouldn't necessarily expect. Ridley Scott has done incredible work with sound over the years. I mean, there's so many filmmakers who've done a lot with it. In particular, I had the experience a few years ago of striking a new print of Kubrick's 2001 to take to the Cannes Film Festival. And we had to lay down the soundtrack on it. So we went on a dub stage and just laid it down exactly as it had been recorded, because the idea was to give the audience the experience of what would it have been like in 1968 to experience that movie. And the sound mix was shocking. I mean, it was so bold and there were moments in there that were just unbelievable, and extremely experimental, for a studio filmmaker. So I've been inspired by all these terrific filmmakers over the years, and we try to use it for the tools that it can give us in terms of storytelling and try and enjoy it a bit.
Speaking of sound, music, let's talk a little bit about your collaboration with Ludwig on this. One thing that I found interesting reading about this film is that, very early on, I think with a lot of your movies, the score and, some of the sound, comes in very early for you. It's not something where you show him the movie and then he goes and writes it. I mean, he's really part of the creative process from the almost the beginning, right? Of sort of just coming up with sort of like a theme or a...
Yeah, I mean, from script stage or even earlier on some of my films.
Yeah.
I've worked with David Julian and Hans Zimmer and James Newton Howard over the years, and with all of them, and Ludwig was no exception. We talked early on, and I said, you got to understand, I don't like to use any temp music. So I don't like to take music from another film while I'm editing and put it on. So I need the composer to get involved at script stage and talk about the ideas and start writing pieces that aren't to picture. Because if you look at any film really, but in particular my films, they're very quick cut. There's a lot of stuff, you know, put in there, and it's very difficult for a composer to write for a 10-second scene or something. I want the composer to come on, and Ludwig did this very early on, and just start exploring musical ideas at length. So 10-minute pieces, 20-minute pieces sometimes. And then the technology that exists for us to edit that music, to take it, unpeel its layers, edit it together in shorter form or to picture. You know, we can do that in the edit suite very easily from what the composer's been doing, and then send it back to them and say, okay, how does this work? You know, you can develop the score from both ends, if you like. Yeah. It's a really fun process, very dependent on modern technology, but technology that the modern composer, whether it's Hans Zimmer or Ludwig Göransson, you know, these guys are all over this stuff, and they'll give you, you know, a track, they'll give you a cue that's divided into sometimes hundreds of tracks. Wow. So all the individual sounds and all the things that you can manipulate and play around with and reorder and try them again to picture, and then sit. And with Ludwig, what we would do is, you know, we would take his demos and we would work with him in the week, and then on Friday we would put the film up. We all sit there and watch the whole thing from beginning to end with whatever new experiments we'd done with the work he'd given us, and then he would go off and write for the next week. We'd do that for months and months. So, wow. I mean, all in, I think Ludwig, I think he worked on the score for over a year. Wow. Yeah, it's a big commitment, and he did an incredible job. I'm absolutely thrilled with it.
Yeah, no, it's an incredible score and soundtrack. And speaking of that, Riva has a question, wants to know about Travis Scott being featured in the movie. You don't normally have songs in your film, she says, and I know, you know, that it seemed like that was maybe a somewhat late thing that came in, right, with that song, or was that always planned, or how did that evolve?
No, it wasn't always planned. I've used songs on the ends of a few of my films. There's a David Bowie song on the end of Memento, for example. Yeah. There's a Tom York song at the end of Prestige. Sometimes that energy feels right to me. What happened in the case of Tenet is Ludwig was getting close to the end of the scoring. We keep watching the film, and then we started taking cues of his and putting them on the end to get a feel for when the credits were applied. Like, what's that going to be like? And we had a couple of things we were pretty happy with. But he, and this is his genius as a composer, but also as a producer, he sort of was able to step back from it and say, yeah, okay, there's something about, as he put it, there's something in the energy of the film that made you want something new at the end, that built on, or was built from things that you'd seen, but wasn't a reprise. Right. Often a reprise works really well. In this case, he felt very strongly that it needed to be new, and he suggested getting Travis Scott involved, and, you know, familiarize me with Travis Scott's work and the great videos he's done and incredible songs. And I said to Ludwig, look, you know, this is a super exciting idea. What do we do? How would we go about that? And Ludwig invited him to a screening, actually in this very screening room. And Travis came and watched the film, and he was one of the first people, really probably the very first person outside of our immediate team who saw the whole thing put together, and immediately had a really exciting and energetic response to it that really showed, you know, he really understood what it was we were trying to do with the music and what Ludwig had laid in there. So Ludwig sent him some of his tracks, and he turned them around and changed them and came up with this fantastic song that I then, when I heard it and we put it on the end of the film, it felt to me like we wanted to take some of his voice and layer it through the rest of the movie. So right from the first frame of the film, actually, there's a little bit of Travis Scott, you know, in here and there, so that by the time you get to the end, you've sort of built up. There's a sound in your ear of his voice that sort of pays off at the end. And I think all of that, it was a really fun collaboration. And I mean, Travis was great to work with, and it really speaks of Ludwig's ability to kind of, you know, he's this great genius who's kind of in his work, but he can also step back as a sort of producer and look at it very objectively and say, okay, let's bring somebody else in and see what we can come up with. It was a really, really fun thing to be a part of.
Yeah, no, super authentic and an incredible song. This next question comes from Yvonne. And Yvonne wants to know, can you talk more about your collaboration with Jennifer Lame, the editor? I think one of the best parts of the movie is the editing, and I'm always fascinated since you edit on film.
Yeah, I mean, it's the first film I've done with Jen, and she did an incredible job. I'd been working with Lee Smith for many years, and he wasn't available for the film. And so I brought Jen on, and she hadn't done action films before. She's done some incredible work on Ari Aster's Hereditary and so forth, and Noah Baumbach's films, but I liked the fact that she hadn't done anything like this. I warned her that, particularly in the third act, we were going to get into some of the most complicated and difficult editing situations that she'd ever be faced with. But I was really looking for her to bring something, fresh to my process in terms of all aspects of the film, and in particular the action. And I think she did a really incredible job with the action. We do finish the film on film, but we've always edited on Avid. So we shoot on film. We print the film, we project it for dailies, and then it gets scanned into the computer. We edit on the computer. We then conform, as it's called. We take the film and we cut that, tape it together to match what we've done on the computer, and then we project that. And that's sort of the way it gets finished. So yeah, she was able to keep editing the way she learned, on the Avid. But it was a really fun experience, working with somebody who hadn't done car chases and fights. It just brought a very fresh approach to it.
Yeah, and there's a lot of action in this film. This next question comes from Anna and it talks about the large-scale action sequences, including the opera sequence, the 747 crash, the highway scenes, and the final battle. She wants to know, which of these was the most difficult to film?
They all had their distinct challenges, which actually was great because none of them were the same.
Right.
But they all had huge challenges. I mean, actually starting from what we call the vault fight, some of the hand-to-hand combat we started with, which was small scale, but it was the first stuff where we were trying to figure out how we were going to shoot this stuff, all the techniques we were going to use. So that was a huge challenge for the first week. The car chase we shot in Tallinn. I mean, I've done plenty of car chases before, but this was, shutting down a major route in a city for about 3 weeks. Very, very challenging stuff. Forwards, backwards, various combinations. I mean, all of it was complicated. I think in some ways, I suppose you'd have to fix on the final battle as the most difficult in a sense, because there are so many complexities to it. We're trying through the film, for the audience, we're trying to sort of build a level of understanding and complexity to how this rule set how you can have fun with it, essentially. And so every time, we would come up with an idea for an earlier scene that didn't fit, we'd say, okay, well, let's save that. Let's see if we can explore that in the final action. And so it became this kind of thing that ballooned and got bigger and bigger and bigger over the months of shooting all the other sequences. And we saved it for the end. And everybody, every department got to really pour all their energy into that sequence. So in some ways, I would say that was the most challenging. But in terms of sheer physical difficulty, I think probably the foils, the sailing scene on those foils, that was a very, very challenging thing to film. No one had ever filmed anything like that before. And even though it's in some ways a small scene, just a little, dialogue scene, but those craft, I mean, they're really incredible. I mean, they're like the sort of, equivalent of Formula One racing cars or something, but of sailboats.
Yeah.
And they're very challenging to work with, and no one had ever done anything like this. So it was all kind of new ground. That was a very difficult sequence.
Wow. All right, we got some more questions for you. More about you as sort of a filmmaker, and this one comes from Dylan Carver, and Dylan, I think, wants some advice. Greetings. What would be your advice to any small-time independent filmmaker wanting to make the jump to celluloid?
To celluloid in particular, my advice would be to get on the internet and see, what kind of camera you could get. There's a lot of incredible equipment out there for very cheap, if it's in good shape and it can be serviced and you can find someone to service it. But there's a lot of great equipment out there, a lot of great opportunities to start shooting celluloid, and getting in touch with the folks at Kodak. they're very receptive to lower budget filmmakers starting out. They really want and continue to reach out to younger filmmakers because obviously that's the future of celluloid, is getting new filmmakers to come in and try it out. Because I think inevitably find, when a filmmaker finally gets the chance to try and shoot actual film, they love it, and they wish they could, always do it. And so having new filmmakers avail themselves of that opportunity is very, very important. So yeah, my advice would be to get in touch with Kodak and to get in touch with, find a great deal on a camera, get your own camera. That would be the way to go, I think, these days.
Absolutely. All right, this next question comes from Riley Rucker. Since I'm involved, I'm not surprised this question came up. Would you ever want one of your films to be adapted into a video game? And if so, which one?
We've looked at some of them over the years.
Inception, I think at one point there was.
We did.
Right?
We went fairly far down the road with it, but of course, what you realize is, making films is complicated.
Yeah.
It takes a long time. Making video games is even more complicated, and it takes even longer.
Yeah.
And the way the video game industry works, and you know far more about it than I do, but it's really tough to, you don't want to just be doing a license game. You don't want to just be tying in with something and using the brand established by the film. Same way, actually, you don't, when you do, people do a video game adaptation to film from a video game, you don't want it to just draft off the brand. You want it to be something great in its own right. And, I think my time and energy, I've just wound up devoting it all to film and just seeing how difficult that is. It's not something you'd ever take on lightly, but it's definitely something I'm interested in. It's an amazing world.
Well, fair response. This next one comes from Carson Oak, and Carson wants to know: would you ever try and tackle a horror film? The genre would be so interesting in your style of directing.
Definitely. The thing about horror is it's the most purely visceral of genres. And that is a type of filmmaking that I am, if you watch, Dunkirk in particular is one that, it's all about the physicality of the situation for the characters and the visceral response. And so it's definitely a genre I'm interested in. It's very rare to get a great scenario for a horror movie that really holds up and would really justify the time. There are some incredible horror movies, but not that many, I suppose. It's tough, but it's definitely something I would be interested in exploring at some point. I'm in no rush. I've got time, try different things, but it's certainly on my mind, yeah.
Speaking of like genres like horror, that video game question, when you think of your career kind of moving forward, are you intrigued by telling stories in other ways? I think of, games, but even you look at like Bandersnatch and like interactive things and things like, when you think of kind of the scripts and stories you want to tell, explore other genres, but are you interested in other forms of sort of, telling stories?
I am interested in other forms, but I'm also, the longer I work in film, the more I'm sort of humbled by the sense of it as a medium, that it can do anything and be anything. And so, in a way, I feel like I'm just scratching the surface of what's possible in terms of what you could do with, the theatrical film format itself. So in a way, it's like I got plenty of room, and it's a plenty big enough playground to stay in a way. And so I think, as I said, the longer I work in film, the more I realize that the screen itself, the form of it and everything, they're just jumping off points for infinite possibilities. And so I think I want to carry on doing that.
Nothing wrong with that. We'll look forward to what's next. Savigya wants to know, have there been times working on a script that you thought that you'd never be able to complete it? You have that writer's block?
Every day on a script. Yeah, definitely. It's something any writer deals with a lot. Every problem always seems insurmountable. The cruel thing, the cruel trick that your mind plays on you when you're writing is you sort of go to bed at night thinking, I've got the whole thing worked out and I can write it no problem tomorrow. And then you sit down and you're like, hang on, it seems so simple till I started writing it. And you're often getting stuck. I think the longest I was stuck The longest I was stuck was on Inception. I got to page 80 or so. I had 2 acts of it, and I was stuck for about, 10 years or so, I did other things as well. I wasn't sitting at the typewriter, all work and no play. Yeah, it wasn't that. But, I was just jammed on it. And then I had a breakthrough. And the old cliche of if you're having trouble, if there's something wrong with the third act, it's actually wrong with the first and second act. That's where you really need to do the work. I have always found that to be true. Like if you're absolutely stuck, on that third act, it probably means that some of the groundwork you laid in the first 2 acts is flawed somehow. And with Inception, that was definitely the case. And I went back and with a new take on it, and it then got finished pretty rapidly.
Do you tend to have a few ideas that you're most passionate about, kind of in parallel you're thinking about, or do you singularly focus on one project?
It's different at different points in my life, really.
Yeah.
There have been times when I've had to have multiple things on the go. Certainly when we were doing the Dark Knight films, I was working on other things at the same time, but those films were so big and kind of all-consuming that, along with my brother and David Goyer, we sort of had to be kind of finishing one film. When I was finishing The Prestige, for example, I already had Nathan Crowley on designing for The Dark Knight and so forth. And I'm not generally comfortable with doing more than one thing at a time, but there have been moments where you've sort of had to think about more than one thing. What I like doing between films is exploring a range of different ideas, a whole set of possibilities. But there's always that moment, for me at any rate. Other filmmakers are different, everybody's different, but for me, there has to be this moment where you commit, mentally you commit, and you go, okay, I'm gonna fully concentrate on this for as long as it takes to get it done.
And before you get to that commit stage, do you have like a few ideas that are sort of populating in your mind of different directions and you pick one, or what's your kind of process of kind of picking the next project?
It's
different every
just
time, I'm
been
sure.
different. It's literally been different every time. It comes back to story, simple as that. If you get wrapped up in the story and you feel you know how to tell it, then you get excited about, all that focus and all that concentration. And then you're creating a world that you're happy to live in for a couple of years. Because it takes a long time and it takes a lot of focus. At least the way I work, I'm not really able to do anything else when I make a film. So, you really have to know that it's something you're still going to care about in a couple of years.
Yeah. This next question comes from Bojack. Bojack wants to know, in your formative years, did you ever have a mentor who played a part in who you are as a filmmaker today?
So many great inspirational figures in film. But the wonderful thing about film and the era I've grown up in, as really I suppose the first, home video generation set of filmmakers on my age. So we got our first VHS player in the early 80s, or when I was 12 years old or something. And so I've been able to grow up with inspirational figures in my creative life who I never met, and I never had that particular mentor relationship with. My parents were very encouraging of me and lent me a Super 8 camera, old Super 8 film, when I was a little kid, I was 7, 8 years old. But I think I would point to being able to access all of film history through home video. And so, I was able to study the work of, Ridley Scott and Nicholas Roeg, and later on, Terrence Malick and Kubrick and people like that. I then had the great fortune of being able to meet, some of these people, met the great Terrence Malick, and I've met Ridley Scott, and that's a wonderful thing. But you can have that. And for kids today, it's even more so. Everything is accessible so easily, which is a great thing because you can really drill into, okay, what are the great filmmakers of the past? What have they done and how have they done it? And really sort of study that for yourself.
Yeah. This next question is about IMAX. Jacob wants to know, what is your favorite shot that you have captured with an IMAX camera?
In some ways it'd be difficult to pick favorites, but I'd probably have to go with the opening shot of The Dark Knight, which was sequentially the first thing we did on IMAX, or at least the first thing we showed to an audience on IMAX. And every time we ever screened the film for an audience, there was a gasp at that shot moving in on the building like that. And it was thrilling to see people kind of respond to just the format itself and the shot. It'd be a toss-up between that and the shot of Heath Ledger standing on the corner that comes right after it, you know, holding the mask in his hand. I mean, there's something about that. It was another filmmaker actually came up to me and talked about, it was actually James Cameron. He had talked about shooting on IMAX for many years ago, and I'd first read about, you know, his idea about, well, you shoot larger format negative and you extract the 35mm portion. And so that stuck in my head, and that was eventually what we, you know, years later actually did, you know, on The Dark Knight. And you know, he told me when he saw that shot, he knew that it was going to work, you know, that the format and the formatting, the way we'd done it would work. There is some special relationship with that IMAX frame and that shot of Heath standing there in the corner. So there's a couple. And then we've gone on to do so many things that I've just loved doing with the IMAX camera. But there's something about those first couple things, where we didn't know if it would work. That was the thing. So to see that it worked, that was a unique thrill.
Yeah, an incredible sequence. This next question comes from Ethan. Ethan wants to know, what would you say was the most challenging film of yours to make, and why?
I mean, they've all been challenging in their own ways. You know, I find filmmaking incredibly fulfilling, but I do find it hard. I think if you were to ask my crew, I think Dunkirk rates pretty highly as a difficult film. I actually didn't find it so. I mean, I don't mind the weather and all of those conditions, and there was a real focus on a small core group of us, you know, around the camera in that film, so I actually enjoyed that one. I think Tenet was very difficult because of the range of action set pieces we were trying to do and how much of the world we were trying to cover. The combination of that with the unique sort of difficulty of visualizing how the timelines would work, of how the opposing timelines would work with this concept of inversion. It was something that wasn't possible to intuit. So however long I worked with the idea, you could write it on the page, you could analyze it and describe it, but until you actually started seeing the footage, you couldn't fully engage with it. You couldn't fully understand it. So every day on set, we had a big group of people sitting talking about, okay, hang on, does this happen before this and all the rest? And the way we dealt with that in the end was to have the visual effects guys do what they call previs, you know, pre-visualization of the scene, but not from a camera perspective, from a sort of
It's like a top-down
diorama.
Like,
yeah, kind of top-down. You could look at it at any angle and just look at the logic of that. And so, you know, Bodhi on set, he worked for the visual effects department. He would be my go-to. He would always have his laptop and he'd say, okay, tell me this. Does this happen before that? Is that, you know, whatever. And he would, every time he would start to answer and I'd say, don't answer, because you'll probably be wrong. We always are when we try and intuit it. Go away and study it for 10 minutes and then come back and tell me. And so that was how that went down. But that made it a very unique set of challenges, particularly for me, because I'm the guy who has to have the answers on set, you know, because the actors or technicians or whatever they're going to say on how do you want this, how do you want that? And I had a good sense of things. But one of the things I found really exciting about working on this movie is you had to shoot it. You have to see it to understand it. You to know what it is. It doesn't really work fully as a screenplay. It couldn't be a novel. It couldn't be a stage play or a radio play. Like, it has to be a movie because the camera itself sees time and can show us time in different ways. And that's what the whole concept is based on. It's okay, let's look at time differently. Let's look at the action of a big action movie differently by approaching time differently. You have to see it. You have to experience the movie to kind of know what it's on about.
Yeah, I can't imagine the continuity department on this trying to, you know, pull all again. Did you ever trip yourself up at some point and say like, oh wait, no, we changed this, or like, you know, there's so many things going on in so many levels.
You know, it's interesting. I made mistakes all the time. While I was writing the script, I was pleased to find out as we started translating the script into previs and answering all the questions that I hadn't made very many mistakes in the script. That I was sort of pleased about. I'd got into some kind of way of looking at it that actually seemed to work when you then looked at it objectively or kind of built a model of it. But every day on set, I, like everybody else, you'd be thinking procedurally about what order things happen in, and you'd make one mistake early on in your thinking, and then everything else is cascading. And we would all do it all the time. And the problem with that kind of cascading set of assumptions or mistakes is that because you don't know you've made an error in the beginning of your thinking, you are absolutely convinced. You can see it. And it was interesting. There was a level of humility that developed for everybody on the set where we all sort of learned to not commit, actually, and to say, I think it's this, but let's talk it through, which actually became a fun process in the end.
Did you ever, did you have to reshoot something, or did you catch it early enough? Or I'm curious how that, manifested itself.
I think the only time we made an actual sort of mistake was in the first week where we ran the camera the wrong way for the way we were staging the scene. And that was the kind of mistake, that we expected to make a lot. But having done it once, in the first week, we got pretty methodical about it. And, the camera guys, they had to film magazines for forwards, film magazines for backwards. And the backwards ones, they had kind of black and white checkered tape all over it and everything, so they would never pick the wrong one. And we learned, I think the reason we didn't make mistakes is we learned, and film units these guys are really good at doing this stuff this way, where you just systematize it. So nothing's casual, nothing's, if you watch a camera crew on a Hollywood set, the way they will pick up the camera, everything is systematized. They do it the same every time, so they know exactly to not make mistakes. And that got applied to our thinking in terms of how we would answer questions and how we would make plans, is we would talk it through in a particular way and then sign off on it once we'd, kind of done that process. The tricky thing is, on a big film, you actually have to be thinking about the next thing at the same time and the thing after that. You kind of got to be 2 or 3 setups, as we call them, 2 or 3 setups ahead to stay on schedule. And that's where it got really tricky, because if you're talking about, you're solving one problem, and if I would start talking about the next one as part of that conversation, which is what I'm used to doing, to keep going, it would throw everything. And so we had to be a little more linear.
Wow. Next question comes from Duncan. Duncan wants to know, did you watch any film for reference before you started to write Tenet?
No, not really. Well, actually, you know what? For my own writing process, I watched a lot of Fritz Lang movies, Fritz Lang Spies in particular. I get a lot of inspiration from going back to the silent era because it's just a completely different set of conventions then. And so you can be really inspired by it. It's sort of going back to what I call first principles of filmmaking. They're not dealing with any of the things that we're dealing with in the modern world. And so you're getting a really fresh look at genre. And I think Fritz Lang, in his work, is this incredible way of looking at the fanciful villains and so forth, integrated into a recognizable world. They're really inspiring from that point of view. So I did a bit of that. But then when we actually came to make the film, we didn't watch a lot of other movies.
And you tend to do that sometimes.
We do. We usually do screenings, and we didn't on this one, partly because it's a spy genre, and that's such a well-established genre. I felt like I didn't want to revisit those. I know those films so well. I know the Bond films so well, and the Bourne movies and all this. So it's kind of in there already. And you don't really want to be looking at the specifics of it. You kind of want to just go with the general inspiration from it.
All right, and last question comes from Twitter. This is a thought-provoking one. What has been the project that has impacted you the most, Chris?
Tough one to answer, really. They all are experiences for me and for my family. You go through things for years. I suppose I would probably have to point to Memento as the single biggest impact, because it was a process of going through being a fully independent filmmaker where we're just, literally shooting with friends and family and catch as catch can and putting 16mm films together and sort of spending other people's money. And then the success of that film opened all kinds of possibilities, for us in terms of how we would maybe get to tell bigger and bigger stories. But they've all had, an extraordinary impact on our lives one way or the other, because they're just experiences that you go through for years. And I love to work with, friends and family, and so they're kind of communal experiences for all of us that we go through.
Yeah. Well, this certainly has been a non-traditional release for this film, but for those of you at home that have not experienced Tenet, it is available now on 4K, Ultra HD, Blu-ray, and digital. An incredible film from an incredible filmmaker, Christopher Nolan. Thanks so much for joining us, and
Thank you.
we'll look forward to the next one.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Chris.